Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The Pentagon says sexual assaults in the military decreased in 2025, with an estimated 20,500 service members experiencing unwanted sexual contact. At the same time, more victims reported what happened to them. But advocates say the number may not tell the whole story, arguing that survivors still face serious barriers to reporting and getting justice. Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen is here to dig into the new report. Rachel, thanks for being here.
Hello, Terry.
The headline here sounds positive. The Pentagon says the prevalence of unwanted sexual contact fell in 2025 and more victims reported an incident. What did those two trends tell us about where the military stands right now?
Yeah, so there are some, encouraging signs, right? The Pentagon estimates that about 20,500 active duty service members experienced unwanted sexual contact last year. That's down from about 29,000 in 2023. And those who reported it, the percentage went up from 25% to 33%. So you have fewer estimated incidents, greater willingness to report them. That points to, efforts to make reporting easier, connect victims with support. That's been a big push in the last several years. One expert that I talked to mentioned specifically the no wrong door approach to reporting. Instead of saying, all right, well, you can only go to this one office, they've opened up a lot of avenues that will refer you to the resources that you need. And also they've been investing in sexual assault prevention and response experts. So, but at the same time, you flip that number over, kind of, 2/3 of people still didn't report unwanted sexual contact. And the Pentagon survey only really lets us look at it every couple years.
With that 2/3 not reporting, what are the biggest barriers to reporting, and how much confidence should we have that those barriers are coming down?
So the Pentagon sees it as an overall positive because reporting, opens up paths to different forms of care for service members that do report and gives leaders the ability to hold people accountable. Protect Our Defenders, a well-known advocacy group for survivors of sexual assault in the military. They have a very different view of it. They say survivors have become more afraid to report. They say whistleblower protections and anonymous report protections have been rolled back, and changes to victim services and prevention programs have come down. And so that has limited people's willingness and ability to come forward. So as the data shows that reporting increased, but it doesn't really establish why. And so I think talking to people, writ large and trying to get a better idea of, why didn't you come forward? Do you feel that these changes have affected you? I think that with a little more time, we may have a more definitive answer on the impacts.
Does Protect Our Defenders offer any evidence to support their concerns?
Yeah, they have. So, Protect Our Defenders argues that the longer term picture is less encouraging. It's not just a point in time that matters. It's the overall trend. So the organization points out that the 2025 estimate is substantially higher than the nearly 15,000 that was the estimate back in 2016, so 10 years ago. And it says its own work with survivors doesn't really match up with this idea of dramatic improvement that the report suggests. So it's really sort of a tug of war over how to interpret that data, and rather than saying that the data proves that fewer assaults are the end all be all.
How do the military's numbers compare to the general population overall?
So the military data shows, pretty similar numbers to the U.S. at large. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center says 1 in 5 women in the U.S. have experienced completed or attempted rape over the course of their life. Nearly a quarter of men have experienced some form of contact sexual violence in their life. That's higher than the DoD numbers. But, I think what's important to consider here is that the military sort of environment is a bit different than, the population at large, right? These are people who live together, work together. They're expected to maintain a culture of respect, a culture of trust. And, that it doesn't always play out in the same way as it does in the US population because, it's a tighter knit, it's a smaller community. You have to run allegations up, through your boss, through, Office of Special Trial Counsel. So it's a much kind of smaller ecosystem with, a little bit different expectations than the U.S. at large.
As you described that special culture in the military, Rachel, the Pentagon says trust in the system has improved. What does their report say about whether service members believe they will be treated fairly if they report?
The report says that men are more likely than women to think that they would be treated fairly by the legal system if this went through that process. On the other hand, they feel less trustworthy or less heard by SAPR staff, so sexual assault prevention response staff, than women do. So it's not necessarily a causation sort of situation. It's more, maybe it's driven by SAPR staff, largely deal with incidents involving women. Their training may be largely focused on women, and so maybe that has kind of created this perception that they're going to be, unfair to men. The expert that I spoke to also pointed out it's a little bit of a apples to oranges comparison because it's asking people, did you feel that SAPR staff were fair, in your actual experience, versus if it went to trial, do you feel like, not a you went through the legal process, how did it go, right? So it's a little bit apples to oranges there.
Rachel, now that this report is out, what happens next?
Certainly, the work to get sexual assaults down further will continue. The Office of Special Trial Counsel, which was stood up about a year ago, it was created to have another path for these sorts of cases to go through, so that you're not just going up the chain of command when you're reporting. So, seeing the effectiveness of OSTC, seeing how OSTC evolves, and so on and so forth. I think seeing how command climate evolves, as a result of some of these investments, whether cuts to the workforce, cuts to the SAPR workforce, specifically what sorts of impact that has, and so on and so forth. And, there's especially been a focus on sexual assault at the military academies. They put out their own stats. And so I think it's going to be something that's watched pretty closely, on the Hill and across the country at large.
That's Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen. Rachel, thanks for this update.
Thank you.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com.